Who invented bread? What if I told you the greatest invention in human history wasn't the wheel, writing, or even fire? It may have been bread. Sounds ridiculous, right? After all, bread is everywhere. You can buy a loaf almost anywhere, and it's so ordinary that most of us never stop to think about it. But remove bread from history, and there's a good chance there would have been no cities, no kingdoms, no pyramids, no Roman Empire, maybe not even the modern world. Because before bread, humans spent nearly every day searching for food. After bread, they finally had the chance to build civilization. So who invented it? The strange answer is, probably nobody. And everybody. To understand why, we have to travel back nearly 15,000 years, long before the first farms, the first cities, or even the idea of civilization. Back then, humans were hunter-gatherers. If the animals moved, they followed. If winter arrived, they packed everything they owned and kept walking. Life was simple: find food, don't become food, and repeat the next day. Hidden across the landscape, however, was a resource almost nobody wanted: wild grain. Tiny seeds covered by tough shells were everywhere, yet most people ignored them. Not because they weren't edible, but because eating them was miserable. Chewing raw grain felt like biting tiny stones, and swallowing it whole did almost nothing because the human body struggled to digest it. Compared to juicy fruit, fresh meat, or crunchy nuts, grain was survival food, the meal you chose only when every better option had disappeared. It looked almost useless, almost. Then one small discovery changed everything. Someone picked up 2 stones, dropped a handful of grain between them, and started crushing. The hard seeds became a soft powder, flour. It sounds ordinary today, but at the time it was revolutionary. For the first time, humans had transformed a food they could barely eat into something completely different. They mixed the flour with water, spread the paste onto a hot stone beside a fire, and waited. A few minutes later, they created something history had never seen before. It wasn't a fluffy loaf or a warm sandwich, just a flat, dry cake that was probably tough, smoky, and not particularly delicious. But it filled your stomach, lasted much longer than meat, and could easily be carried on long journeys. Without realizing it, someone had just baked the ancestor of every loaf of bread on earth. And here's the twist: it almost certainly happened by accident. For decades, scientists believed they already knew the story. Bread came after farming. It seemed obvious. First you grow wheat, then you make bread. End of story. But archaeologists uncovered something that completely shattered that idea. Inside an ancient fireplace in what is now Jordan, they found tiny black crumbs that looked like nothing more than burned leftovers. Under a microscope, however, those crumbs revealed an astonishing secret. They were made from wild grain that had been ground into flour, mixed with water, and baked over a fire. Even more incredible, they were about 14,400 years old, nearly 4,000 years older than agriculture itself. Think about that for a moment. Humans were baking bread before they even knew how to grow wheat. Suddenly, historians were forced to ask a question nobody had ever considered before: what if farming didn't create bread? What if bread created farming? If that's true, then one simple recipe may have changed the entire course of human history. If bread really came before farming, then one question becomes impossible to ignore. Why would hunter-gatherers, who had survived perfectly well for thousands of years, suddenly decide to become farmers? Farming wasn't easier. It meant months of hard labor, planting seeds, protecting crops, waiting for harvest, and hoping the weather didn't destroy everything. Hunting was unpredictable, but farming demanded patience unlike anything humans had ever experienced. So why make the switch? One fascinating theory suggests that bread itself was the reason. Once people discovered how filling and practical bread could be, they wanted a steady supply of grain. Gathering wild grain wasn't enough anymore. It grew only in certain places and only during a short season each year. If bread was worth making, then grain had to become reliable. And the only way to do that was to grow it yourself. In other words, humans may not have invented farming because they loved agriculture. They may have invented it because they loved bread. That single decision changed everything. For the first time, people stopped wandering. They settled beside rivers, planted fields, and waited for the harvest instead of chasing it. Villages appeared where campsites once stood. Villages became towns. Towns became cities. Farmers produced more grain than their own families needed, allowing others to become builders, blacksmiths, merchants, potters, and soldiers. Civilization didn't appear overnight. It grew because someone finally had enough food to feed more than just themselves. In a strange way, bread didn't simply fill empty stomachs. It gave humanity something far more valuable: time. Time to invent, to build, to trade, and to dream. But ancient bread still had one major problem. It was hard. Really hard. Imagine biting into a loaf so dense it felt more like a rock than food. Then, once again, history changed by accident. One day, someone probably mixed flour with water, became distracted, and left the dough sitting for hours. When they returned, something strange had happened. The dough had puffed up with tiny bubbles. Most people would have thrown it away, assuming it had spoiled. Instead, someone decided to bake it anyway. The result was astonishing. The bread became softer, lighter, and far more delicious than anything people had tasted before. Without realizing it, they had discovered fermentation. Invisible wild yeast floating through the air had entered the dough, feeding on its natural sugars and releasing carbon dioxide. Those tiny bubbles transformed bread forever. One of the greatest breakthroughs in culinary history may have happened simply because someone forgot about lunch. For thousands of years, nobody understood why some dough magically rose while other dough stayed flat. Bakers believed it was almost a gift from the gods. They carefully saved a small piece of yesterday's dough and mixed it into tomorrow's batch, passing these mysterious starters from one generation to the next. Long before anyone knew microorganisms existed, humans were already working together with billions of invisible living organisms every time they baked bread. Every loaf was the result of a partnership no one could even see. Then came ancient Egypt, the civilization most people mistakenly credit with inventing bread. In reality, the Egyptians didn't invent it, they perfected it. They built larger bakeries, designed hotter ovens, and experimented with dozens of different recipes. Historians believe they produced more than 40 varieties of bread, flavored with honey, dates, herbs, and spices. Bread was no longer just a way to survive. It became something people genuinely enjoyed. It became so valuable that workers were often paid with bread and beer instead of money. Imagine receiving your salary in fresh loaves every week. Thousands of years ago, that wasn't unusual. It was everyday life. By now, bread had become much more than food. It had become power. Every great civilization understood the same simple truth: whoever controlled grain controlled bread, and whoever controlled bread controlled people. The Romans mastered this idea better than anyone before them. They built enormous bakeries capable of feeding entire cities and even created one of history's most famous political strategies: bread and circuses. As long as people had free bread and free entertainment, they were far less likely to rebel. Imagine that, a simple loaf of bread becoming one of the most powerful political tools ever created. Yet bread also revealed the greatest weakness of every civilization. The moment grain supplies failed, everything else began to fall apart. A poor harvest, a drought, or a war could empty bakeries within days. Families skipped meals so their children could eat. Crowds gathered before sunrise, hoping there would still be bread left by the time they reached the front of the line. Hunger created fear, and fear quickly turned into anger. In 1789, soaring bread prices became one of the sparks that ignited the French Revolution. Whether or not Marie Antoinette ever said, "Let them eat cake," almost doesn't matter anymore. The story survived because it captured a simple truth: when people can't afford bread, even the strongest kingdoms begin to crumble. Today, bread feels almost invisible. It's one of the cheapest and most ordinary foods on earth. Yet hidden inside every loaf is nearly 15,000 years of human history. Every slice carries the story of hunter-gatherers grinding wild grain between stones, forgotten dough rising beside a fire, Egyptian bakers perfecting their craft, Roman ovens feeding great cities, and ordinary families whose lives, and sometimes entire nations, were shaped by something as simple as flour and water. So, who invented bread? The honest answer is that we'll probably never know. There was no single inventor, no unforgettable moment, and no lone genius who changed history overnight. Bread is the result of thousands of years of curiosity, accidents, and small discoveries made by countless people whose names have long been forgotten. But perhaps that's exactly what makes bread so extraordinary. It isn't just one of humanity's oldest inventions. It may be the invention that made humanity possible. Because before we built pyramids, crossed oceans, explored space, or created the modern world, someone, somewhere, mixed flour with water, placed it over a fire, and unknowingly baked the very first taste of civilization.